WNHHLP 103.5 FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Mubarakah Ibrahim, and this is Mornings with Mubarakah. We are streaming live on TuneIn Radio. We are on Periscope, Instagram, Facebook. We're a little bit everywhere, so there's no excuse not to watch. We are in the Beaver Hill section of New Haven, Connecticut, coming to you live every Wednesday morning. And I want to welcome you to the show today. We are going to have, hopefully, a very informative discussion about policy, mental health, and the future of our mental health system here in America. And I would like to thank Rebecca Miller for joining me today. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And I want to thank you for tuning in. We are going to talk about, we're really going to have hopefully a very informative discussion for lay people like myself who is not inside of the mental health industry to understand how treatment and policy really affect us as a community and as a society and as a nation, and how some of the policies and funding that trickle down to us really make an impact on those things. So first and foremost, you should know that Rebecca Miller is she works inside the Department of Psychiatry at Yale as an assistant professor. And she is also the co-author of Deprescribing Psychiatry, which is a book that speaks to
the idea of reducing or eliminating the use of psychiatric meds in a holistic, collaborative way. So oftentimes people go off their psychiatric meds without telling their doctor because there are really disturbing side effects, or they don't feel like they need their medications. And so this is really speaking to practitioners, to doctors, to APRNs, anyone who's prescribing psychiatric drugs, and other folks about how to try and go about doing that in a really thoughtful way. So,
and it's the first book of its kind that really talks about this.
So my co-authors, Dr. Swapnil Gupta and Dr. John Cahill, and I wrote this to really try and bring the issue to light. So it's been something that's been around in geriatric medicine because older folks tend to be prescribed like a whole number, what's called polypharmacy, so beyond a number of medications that can interact and have side effects that end up having really negative impacts for, people end up falling, breaking their hip, etc. So that's in geriatric medicine, they're way ahead of with this. But in psychiatry, it's very new, and there are lots of different issues in psychiatry because you hear, you don't hear in geriatric medicine like, oh, that person's off their meds, that phrase, off their meds. Right, but you do hear that in psychiatry. There's this sort of cultural, societal pressure for people with mental illness to stay on their meds, or what happens when they're off their meds. This kind of thing. So talking about people, deliberately stopping or reducing or stopping their medications can be a little bit provocative, but I think it's really, really important because those medications have really severe side effects that can impact a person's life. There's one called akathisia, which is an inner restlessness. So it's like this, you feel like you have to move, right? But it's really distressing, and people end up ending their lives because of it, because that side effect is so distressing. So, and it often doesn't get taken as seriously as the effect on people. So side effects like that, and those are all kinds of things that we're looking at. Can we find the least amount of medication that you can use to have it be effective for you to live the best life you can? So anyway, went on a little tangent there. But,
but that's good. That's good to know, because it's really, I think that when we think about mental illness, we do think about what kind of medication is the person, can they be given, and do they need more, and do they, and trying
we ask which instead of if, or and that there's there's more and more evidence showing things like exercise for depression is equally effective, or that things like psychotherapy can have longer lasting effects than medication. So yeah, there's a lot.
There's a lot to
talk
it.
about. Yeah.
So if that is something that interests you, you definitely want to go and grab Deep Prescribing Deep Prescribing in Psychiatry. All right. So, but today we are actually going to stay in that same vein of talking about mental health, and we're going. So recently, towards the end of last year, the current administration released their plan for mental health treatment and their increased budget for that. And part of that plan got a little pushback, and it was a little controversial, which was actually increasing the amount of psychiatric hospitals and beds inside of the United States. So if you aren't aware, the number of actual physical beds inside of the United States has decreased significantly since the 1950s and 60s. In the U.S. began shutting down mental institutions in the 50s and 60s and transitioning to a more community-based care, in part to improve treatment for people with mental illness. So in the 50s and 60s, there was like 500,000 beds. Yeah. It's actually down to about 38,000 now. And so I guess for me, my first question is, if we had so many people that needed to be physically institutionalized in the 50s and 60s, are they just like wandering the streets now? Like what happens when we get rid of so many beds? What was the alternative?
So starting in the 50s and 60s, and there's a lot of great books and literature on this too, but a process called deinstitutionalization. So it's they're recognizing more and more the negative impacts of being institutionalized, right? That people, lost their sense of autonomy, lost their sense of hope, like developed all kinds of negative became more dependent on others and weren't kind of living full lives. And so there's that. There's also development of new medications, which led to new treatments. There was a civil rights movement. So noting that a lot of these hospitals, while they had started out as true asylums, like true safe places for people to be, had become overcrowded and basically were warehousing people. And so it wasn't really a safe place. It wasn't really a effective treatment. It was really just sort of a dumping ground for people that were struggling, and that there wasn't another place to care for them. Also, during the 60s was the development of Medicaid and Medicare, so the passing of that legislation. So there were ways to pay for services outside of hospitals. So a whole number of different policy changes, social movements. A lot of folks who had been hospitalized came out of those hospitals and said, this is not okay. It's the survivor ex-patient movement. So basically folks saying like, those hospitals were terrible, that I was mistreated. These are human rights violations. These are civil rights violations, et cetera. So a whole number of different forces kind of came together to move people back, have people move back into their communities. So the idea of, the best thing for folks is to live in the communities of their choice, and to, work, that people want to, have purpose, have meaning, and live a life like everyone else. So there was this big push, and our, local mental health center was built during that time.
Oh, really?
Connecticut Mental Health Center was built in 1966 as part of that movement. The problem was that they never were fully funded. So there was this, there was a great idea and great philosophy of having people, move back in the community, get all these supports in the community, have their treatment in the community, but you need to pay for that. You need to actually fund it. So, so that money didn't actually come to those community services. So that was a challenge. And then in 1980, especially, Ronald Reagan, who was president, when he became president, shifted to a block grant mechanism, which basically gave money to the states, and it basically like defunded the community mental health movement. So without the money to actually support people, people did end up becoming homeless, and experiencing trans-institutionalization. So moving from one institution to another, right? So from the state hospital, mental hospital, to jail, prison, nursing home, etc.
How did that whole transition affect people actually being diagnosed? So people had treatment that was not available previously, but did it affect like how people were diagnosed at all?
So, meaning,
so when people, how did people, the diagnosis that identified them to be placed inside of a mental institution, did that change when we went more to a community-based model?
So it wasn't, I don't know if they're directly linked, but there has been changes in how mental illness has been diagnosed over the years. So, and that's another piece that actually I think it was 1973, until 1973, homosexuality was considered a mental illness, was in the DSM. So there's a very mixed history there. So that was another piece. So the diagnostic.
So people were actually hospitalized for homosexuality.
Yes.
Oh wow.
Yes. So that's a big. I mean, that's
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Wow. So I mean, once that, and there was I had to be a big movement to pull that out of the DSM, and I'm not as familiar with that history, but so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is what is used to diagnose people with mental illness, or has been since, I'm not sure actually when the first one was developed, but it's changed and it's on its 5th version now. So so over the years, different diagnoses have changed. So it's not meant to diagnose an illness. It's the people who wrote that manual say it's diagnosing disorders, not illnesses or diseases. So this is a whole nother, a much longer discussion. But
so it was all a part of kind of like this process.
So yeah, there are changes in that.
The mental health industry.
Yes. Okay. So we drastically reduced the number of hospital beds for people, with the idea that people could be treated in the community, and if they needed that level of care, hospitalization, that they could, so I'll give an example, just like Connecticut related. Instead of going to Middletown to go to Connecticut Valley Hospital, to the state hospital, they'd go to Yale Psychiatric Hospital, right? And they'd be there for just as long as it took to have people be, well enough to return to their home in New Haven, right? As opposed to going to Middletown and spending years there before coming back.
So that brings up actually one of the points of the new funding, which is you talked about people being in a facility until they're well enough coming home. Part of this new funding for that the administration has put forth is actually to increase the mandatory number of beds, and also ordered, or how is it phrased? When they make you stay, right?
Right. Involuntary.
That's the word I was looking for. Involuntary.
Right. So on the one hand, right, it seems like why wouldn't we want more hospital beds for people, right, and make sure they get the care that they need? And there is a big problem of people languishing in the emergency room, like in the hallways of the emergency rooms around the country. I mean, this is happening in a lot of places because there are not enough beds. So, and there's some organizations that say, have created like an algorithm to say, well, this is the number of beds we need based on needs variables, right? And so we don't have enough. My question is, is hospitalization really the thing that's necessary, right? So when, and I have my own experience of being hospitalized, of having mental illness and going into the hospital a couple times. And it's a really challenging, disruptive experience, right? For any time you go into the hospital, it's really, your whole life is turned upside down. Right. All of a sudden, nothing is in your control, right? You can't control when you get the food. You can't, everything is kind of controlled for you, whether you like it or not. Right. So I guess one of my thoughts on that is, is our hospital beds what we really need, or do we need different kinds of services that are more flexible and that can help people stay, like, for example, in their apartments? So, if someone is experiencing greater distress, and is having a harder time, does it make sense for them to go to the ER and then try and wait for a hospital bed? Or would it make more sense for, them to be able to call and get someone to come to their house and spend more time with them, right? They need a companion service or something like that like helps support them. Or are there other kinds of other facilities like respites?
So my question is, how do we determine, not at we meaning just as a society, as a system, whether or not a person needs to go to an ER or if they just need a companion service? Because obviously, if somebody's having a schizophrenic breakdown, they don't need a companion service. They need to actually.
Well, that's an open question, I think.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I would say, so I'll give an example from my own experience. So I was never diagnosed with schizophrenia, but I did have psychosis, right? Which is, some folks, it's like a difficulty with reality, right?
Okay.
That so when I became really, really distressed, I was unable to communicate with other people. Like, I was almost totally mute, and I was very kind of distressed, and I was speaking all in metaphor, right? So it was confusing. So anyway, I was actually in San Francisco at the time. This was probably 20 years ago now, but and I was speaking to my mother on the phone, and she could tell that I was not speaking clearly. Like, she was confused by what I was saying. She knew that something was going on. So she had her friend call the police in San Francisco. The police showed up at my friend's house door, and they handcuffed me and took me in the back of a police car to the hospital.
Without asking you questions?
Well, so I guess, so I had a previous experience of being hospitalized, so I think my mother probably talked to them and said, like, has mental illness, blah, blah, blah. So they wanted to take me to the hospital to be evaluated.
Okay.
And and my memory is a little fuzzy of it, so there may be more details that I'm missing, but that was what ended up transpiring. So when I was in the back of the police car in handcuffs behind my back, they said, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And so and I said, I responded if I could find a fun way to do it, which is a bizarre thing to say.
Okay.
but this was like my thinking at the time, which was very off. I don't contest that. But so I got to the hospital. They put me in a room by myself, and they left me there, right? And so periodically doctors would come in and ask me some questions, and then they would leave. But I was so lonely. All I wanted to do was talk to somebody. So I guess, and that is a very specific individual example, but I just don't know that the hospital was necessarily the thing that I needed right then. I really wanted someone to come in and sit with me and talk to me. And I tried. I knocked on the door. It's called the seclusion room. I knocked on the door of the seclusion room, and the aide would come and open the door and say, "What?" And I would just look at him because I couldn't speak, and he would laugh and shut the door and walk away.
So that was 20 years ago. Has anything changed in that 20 years, you think?
I hope so. But I think, unfortunately, so I guess that example is very, there are more things like cure run respites, right? Which are not hospitalization, but they're a chance for people to go and, be in kind of a the home-like setting with folks there who are paid to support them, and they can, stay there for a certain amount of time to kind of help themselves feel better and get the support. But it's not a hospital. It's not so restricted. They're not kind of the same, and it's not so expensive.
One of the feedbacks from the administration's new policy about creating more beds is that this is kind of like a reverse in what's seen as a progression in the mental health industry. That it is, and it's not going to create the solutions that they are proposing. So one of the things that both that the administration has talked about is that it will be a solution to gun violence, and that as Trump has said, we don't want dangerous people on the streets or having guns. And the interesting thing when it comes to just particularly crime and mental health is they also point out that about a third of the people who are in prisons actually have mental health problems. Does crime and particularly gun violence, is that intertwined with mental health? And do you think it is going to make a difference in that?
So I'll just start by saying this is not my primary area of expertise, but just from some of the reading I've done and some of what I know about it, I'll say a couple of things that, in general, the research findings are mixed, but they generally say that people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than to perpetrate violence. That's the kind of overall statement. And there is like a small percentage in some research studies that show that people who are not receiving treatment for mental illness and who are also using substances are more likely to commit acts of violence. But it's a very small increase, and it's also kind of confounded by, meaning like it's not clear from the research that's they're mixed findings from different studies, so it gets really complicated. It's hard to have like a single soundbite to say this is what it is, because it's not quite that clear, and we really haven't done the research. But in fact, the people who are most likely to commit violence, at least from some of the findings, are men age 18 to 25 who have a history of driving under the influence.
Really?
Yeah. So there's a lot of talk about like, well, we should restrict access to guns for people with mental illness, but then there are other kind of
factors,
demographic groups that are we going to do, where does that kind of leave us? So I'm not advocating any of that, but I'm saying that it's much more complicated than that, and that I think that there's this tendency when something happens to then say, oh, well, that wouldn't have happened unless the person had mental illness. And so there's this kind of retroactive diagnosing, even if the person had never been involved in the mental health system, which many folks hadn't. So,
because we've talked before about how many of the mass shootings in the United States, even though the first heading that is always up there is that this person had mental health problems, it's very rare that they were in the mental health system or they actually had mental health problems. I think in a way it makes us feel better to think that there was something wrong with that person that we can identify and put a finger on, because it's really hard for us as I think as people to just realize that some people are just evil.
I disagree with that, though. I mean, I don't think it's either that they're sort of, are they mad or are they bad, right? But it's also like, what is the breakdown in society that is leading people to feel so alienated and so disconnected that they end up doing something like that?
It's a moral issue too that we have to, I think, that we face, because the truth is that we've always had access to guns in the United States, but we weren't doing mass shootings in the 50s and 60s. So what is it that I think that I do agree with that there has been a breakdown, I think, of the ethics that we have and the morals that we have as a society that leads to people.
I don't know if I would say morals or ethics as much as like social connection and maybe those related.
The reason why I say morals and ethics, because I think that just the idea that it's okay to take another life has changed. More people are showing, both in mass shootings and just like urban violence and just violence in general, that people have taken it, I think, more to like, I can do this. I don't think that so many people even thought that way. And so that's why I say, like, the level of our and I say our just as general,
Yeah.
but has declined for us to even feel like, you know, this is okay, like this is actually a solution to my problem. So
Yeah, I mean,
I use it in
Yeah.
that respect.
I mean, I guess I see it as people becoming so desperate and so demoralized and so, distressed that can happen, and that they feel. I mean, I think that the sense of people feeling like they don't belong, or that they're, kind of not accepted. I think that is one factor that we need to look at as a society. But
So if you are just tuning in, you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, New Haven's home for community radio. We are streaming live on newhavenindependent.org as well as TuneIn Radio. And you are listening to Mornings with Mubarakah, and we are talking with Dr. Rebecca Miller, and we're talking about some of the new policies around mental health treatment and institutionalization that will affect the mental health system. One of the things that have been kind of like thrown out there as far as before I get into that, I wanted to ask you, so the idea, what is your thoughts on the idea that we have decreased beds for traditional mental health institutions, and really what we're doing is taking these people who need the beds and just putting them in prison? Because a third of the people in prison actually have mental health issues. And so one argument is that, well, if we had places to put them where they could be properly treated and diagnosed, then they would not have committed the crime or been in a position to be placed in prison. What is your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that that seeing it, that sometimes the argument is made like either or, and that I think it can be, something slightly different, which is that it's not necessarily beds that we need, but a whole range of different treatment alternatives that make it. So right now, oftentimes, the move from like being in the hospital to being in the community can be dropping off a cliff, kind of, because you go from everything is done for you in some sense. You get so much support. You're checked on like every hour, and how you're doing, how you're feeling, and then you leave, and then there's
nothing,
right? If you in certain circumstances, you could go back to your apartment by yourself. Kind of it's a huge change. And so I think if we can develop more and kind of different levels of support. So we have some now. There are supported housing programs that offer, different residential settings or group home or kind of those. But if we have even more of those kinds of settings, because I know at least in New Haven there are long wait lists for all those programs. So if we can have more of those, and then also more of what's called housing first. So oftentimes housing programs for people with mental illness and or addictions are contingent on them, for example, being sober or attending programs. But for a lot of folks especially folks who have an active addiction, they're not interested in that. So they won't come off the street into an apartment if they can't get clean on the street, right? So how are they going to demonstrate that in order to get the housing? So it's a model that started in LA, I think, in California, probably 20 or so years ago, but it's called Housing First. So it's like no barriers to entry, right? We give you this apartment with kind of no strings attached, with the idea that that's actually going to help support you in making gains in your mental health and in your, working on your addiction, things like that.
And do we have that in Connecticut?
And we have some, yeah, but and there's some across the country, but it's something that is that we need a lot more of, because housing is just a huge crisis. It's a huge problem for folks. Securing housing.
Does this new policy address that at all?
No, as far as I know, no. I mean, so it's focused on waivers for the IMD, the institutions for mental disease.
Right. So we actually didn't mention that yet. So one part of this, the new funding is Prior to now, Medicaid did not pay for individuals to enter into institutions that had more than 16 beds. And the purpose of that restriction was to prevent the quote unquote warehousing of people with mental illness. So with the new policy, doctors can actually apply for a waiver that will allow someone who needs to be institutionalized to actually enter a facility that has more than 16
right,
beds.
to get payment for,
and to get payment
if they enter. Yeah. So I mean, I think that is problematic, and that it could end up moving us further and further back to institutionalization. That we, the kinds of, now I don't agree. I mean, I think it is a problem that we have so many people who have mental illness in jails and prisons. That's a huge issue. And there are, some solutions, and I think New Haven does a very good job of that through things called like jail diversion, and basically trying to catch people when they're coming into the criminal justice system, the legal system, to make sure that it seems like what crime they committed is related to their mental illness, or that they can divert them from jail or prison to a kind of treatment program instead.
Oh, we have that.
So those kinds of programs, we need more funding for those kinds of programs, and support for people coming out of jail and prison, to kind of help them get back into the community in a successful way. But I think that just building more hospital beds, I mean, one of my critiques of that is like, are we so uncreative that we have no other solutions that we can offer than sort of, building more hospitals? So that I would love to hear, folks who are listening, like, what ideas do we have that, could be different from going backwards with what I see, kind of increasing hospital beds.
Do you see this as is there an either or? Is it, could we use more but not as many as the administration is suggesting? Or do you think like we're good where we are, we just need to put our resources other places?
I don't think it's that clear. I mean, I don't think there's good research. I wish there were like good research on like, oh, this is exactly the number of hospital beds for, for this number of people, this is the number of beds we need. But it doesn't kind of fall out that simply and that clearly. I think also that if we can move towards better services in the community, that's going to help support less need for hospital beds as well. So there's something we were talking a little before about this idea of like assisted outpatient treatment in the community, and the administration put more money towards what is euphemistically called assisted outpatient treatment. It's outpatient commitment, or court ordered. People are ordered by the court to have treatment even when they're in the community. So usually the only way you can be involuntarily committed to a hospital if you are, the laws differ by state, but it's generally if you're found to be imminent risk of harm to self or others, right? So if you're feeling like you want to kill yourself or kill someone else, or that you're so disabled by your mental condition that you can't take care of yourself.
So how is that a bad thing that we have improved or increased that funding for that?
So here's the thing, in my opinion. Assisted outpatient treatment, AOT, I'm just going to call it for expediency, it's putting the onus on the wrong party, right? So it's saying the person is legally obligated to go to treatment, but oftentimes it's that the treatment is not kind of available to the person, or is not appealing to the person. So it's sort of like, instead of obligating the treatment to be available, so this all came about, the first outpatient commitment law started in New York City after this very famous case of a man diagnosed with schizophrenia, Andrew Goldstein, who was hearing voices that told him to push a woman onto the subway tracks. So she was killed. Tragic incident. And her name was Kendra Webdale. And the narrative that got created around this was that he needed treatment and he wasn't, that he wasn't getting the treatment that he needed because he didn't know that he was sick. And so, therefore, if we, legally obligate him to go to treatment, this would have prevented the whole incident.
Okay.
The thing was, he had gone in twice in the previous 2 weeks looking for treatment and been turned away because they didn't have enough services available.
So does this new kind of like funding for AOT help services to actually be available when people like that come in?
It should, but why do we need to legally obligate people in that case? Right? That just doesn't make sense to me, and that seems like it's like putting the problem on the person when it's really on the system.
So, but isn't the funding of it? So, I don't push you back a little bit because I really think that for me to understand kind of like how this is actually going to impact the people and the system, to fund the system seems to do both to me. Right? It's saying that we're going to give you more resources to be able to increase the amount of people who are coming, increase the services for the people who we are now mandating come to you.
Right. So in my mind, so there's some research studies showing that AOT is effective, AOT, has better outcomes. But in my mind, they haven't pieced apart, like, is it the legally obligating the person to go? Or is it the fact that they're actually providing the services that they should have been providing in the first place? So I talked to a woman who was, we were having a conversation about this, and she was saying, well, my friend, got kicked out of services because he didn't show up 3 times, and so now I'm trying to get him on AOT, right?
He got kicked out because he didn't show up?
Right.
But if you have mental health issues, then you probably have other issues around why you're not showing up.
And he was supposed to be in services that, and this is not in Connecticut, this is elsewhere, but he was supposed to be in services that are called ACT, which is Assertive Community Treatment. And those are services for people who are not really able to get into the office, not able to come. They're supposed to assertively go out into the community to treat them, right?
Wow.
So I'm like, well, this is not a problem of him needing legal obligation to get, and it seems like a waste of money and time to actually pursue that versus like, why aren't we actually providing the services that, are we say would be effective for this person? So that's where I get, and I also feel like it's sort of blaming the person for something that is a systemic issue.
So how do you think that we should think about mental health treatment and policies going forward?
I think that it's really important that we keep a civil rights perspective on mental health policy and that is essential, especially considering like when we talked about diagnosis, about homosexuality being in the DSM, and then we know that there are health disparities in terms of treatment and diagnosis. So that we need to keep that in mind because it can, for example, psychiatry can be misused. We've seen it, it still happens here. We've seen it in the past. For example, in Russia, political dissidents end up getting hospitalized for psychiatrically. Like it can be used as a very negative tool of social control.
I actually read once that during slavery that slaves who kept trying to run away was actually diagnosed with mental illness.
Yes,
because they wanted to run away from slavery. So yes, it has been used for political aim.
Yes.
Yes, for sure.
Yes, and there's still a higher rate of misdiagnosis of psychotic disorders in Black men versus other populations. So there's still racial disparities in diagnosis and treatment. So Yeah, all those things play out. So I think it's really important for us to keep like a civil rights and social justice perspective and not to necessarily locate societal problems in a person, right? So the fact that a person is, depressed because they can't find a job and there's, they're being discriminated against, and you want to say like, well, you better take care of that depression, or if they're also like, we need to make social change, and we need to, change the circumstances that are contributing that.
So I don't want to end a conversation about mental health without giving people resources if they actually think that they need. So we know that 211 is a resource here in Connecticut. Do you have any other resources that you can recommend people if they feel like they do need help with their mental health?
Yeah, so I mentioned the Connecticut Mental Health Center, which is in downtown New Haven, and there you can walk in anytime between 9 and 5 and get support right there. There's always your local ER, but I think also there's so many resources online these days too. There are so many kind of support groups and alternative viewpoints on mental illness that can be really helpful for folks who don't feel like the traditional mental health system really captures what they're experiencing. Peer support is really important, so people with their own experience with mental illness, connecting with others. And I think there's just a lot of support out there. So, and I think that more and more people are feeling comfortable talking about this and talking about their experiences.
For sure.
So
I think that actually has been, I will give credit to the internet.
Thank you, internet.
Thank you, internet. People have been more comfortable talking about their experiences, which, because of the reach of the internet, has really sparked a larger conversation. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was definitely informative, as I knew that it would, and knowing how mental health really affects our society, I think is something that was so many things that we have to be cognizant of, but it's kind of like one of the pieces in the puzzle that makes us who we are. And so I thought it would be very appropriate. I found a really great quote by a former U.S. Vice President, Hubert Humphrey, who was the Vice President under Gerald Ford. He said, "The moral test of government is how that government treat those who are in the dawn of their life, the children, those who are in the twilight of their life, the elderly, those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped." And with that, I want to thank you for joining me. And remember that we are here live every Wednesday at 10 a.m. And I hope to see and hear from you about your feedback about some of the things that we discussed. I'll be monitoring the comments underneath our social media. Thank you for joining me. Remember, go about your week to be a voice and not an echo. And remember that we are here live every Wednesday at 10 a.m. And I hope to